So thanks everyone for joining us at this Politics of Economics seminar based in CRASSH. It's really good to have you back here with us. Today our main speaker is Grieve Chelwa. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Institute for the Harvard Center for African Studies and the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, and is currently based at the New School at the Institute on Race, Power and Political Economy, where he leads their work on inclusive economic rights. Grieve today will be talking in particular about an article that he published in Economy and Society asking, does economics have an Africa problem? In conversation with Cleo Chasseneri-Zaygouche, one of our organizers who is a JRF at FITS and a postdoctoral fellow in CRASSH at Cambridge. Before we get going, we'll just do the brief poll that we've been doing in many of these seminars. If Una can just put that up on your screen to answer. And as you do that, I'll just remind you that this is being recorded. So if you want to ask questions later in the seminar after the conversation with Cleo and Grieve opens up to the audience, then please be aware that this is maybe uploaded to YouTube later. And also to let you know that next week we will have Melinda Cooper here presenting on her new work. So please do join us for that next Tuesday if you're free. We're really looking forward to that conversation too. Okay, so I'll just give that one more second to unfold on your screens. I think we're almost there if we want to end the poll, and you can see how we're doing, and we'll share the results, and I will let Cleo take the floor.
Yes, thanks a lot. Very happy to see you and everyone and for this webinar. I just start by a very simple question. So you could just maybe explain a bit what's in this article. So what is this problem? What is the Africa problem that this discipline has in your view? And can you just introduce us to the main point in your article about this?
Thanks so much, Cleo. First of all, I want to say thanks to Alice for that warm introduction. Certainly it's nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this seminar. And thanks to Cleo for organizing it and, just being very nice. So what is this problem? It's got many layers, I think. I think on the one hand, there's a problem of representation, right? So the problem of diversity. And I think it's not controversial to say that sort of representational diversity, one sort or the other, I think it's now, we're going to the point where we recognize that diversity is important, right? I mean, I think this thing is not controversial to say here. There's also the problem that economics as a discipline, and I think when one says economics as a discipline, I think one is talking about sort of mainstream vintage's the most influential sort of version of economics does not quite understand the continent, right? And then there have been instances in history where that misunderstanding has sort of played itself out quite concretely, where you've had policy misdiagnosis and all those kinds of things. So I think at a very basic level, this problem is a problem of representation on the one hand. It's a problem of misdiagnosis, which is possibly related to the problem of lack of diversity and representation and those kinds of things. But I suspect we might get into more depth in unpacking some of those issues in this particular conversation. So I hope that helps, Cleo. Yeah.
That's very straightforward. And so in your paper, you give some sort of evidence, because there is many, about how you sort of quantify this lack of representation. Can you just give us some idea of the extent of this underrepresentation?
So I mean, I hope I can remember some of the figures in my paper off the top of my head. I haven't looked at it since it was published. It's one of those things, was a labor of love, and once it was published, you just sort of don't want to look at it again. But I think, so one has to establish a criteria of representation, right? So the one that I use in the paper is to look at geography, where you are when you are writing a particular paper about the continent. And so what I do, first of all, I look at, I think I can't recall, but I look at 10 of the most influential journals in economics. And by influence, what do we mean by, again, that's another sort of thing that one has to unpack. What is influence? Influence as measured by, I think, citation counts or something like that. And I think we all know that that's very problematic because there's a politics of citation also related to that. But be that as it may, that is sort of the criteria I use to establish the most influential journals. That at least whose this coverage, subdisciplinary coverage, might be relevant to issues of the African continent. So I look at those journals, and then I look at papers published in those journals between 2005 and 2015. So in this list of journals, you might have the Journal, for example, of Development Economics. You might have the Journal of African Economies. That one is very straightforward. It's a Journal of African Economies, so you know. And then, so I look at papers published between 2005 and 2015. And then what I do is I look at the share of authors, right, on those papers, that at least one, if a paper has at least one author who's located on the African continent, and I count it as, at least there's some African input into the paper. And I must say here, I don't really care where you are from in the world, but as long as your institutional affiliation at the time the paper is published is, say, the University of Zambia, then I count you as Africa-based. So I use this phrase Africa-based, not necessarily African. I use this phrase Africa-based, right? I mean, some people might say I should have, sort of been much more specific and looked at Africans. That's a bit tricky, right? Because then I would have to, I can't identify, I'm not that smart to identify or just off the top of the name whether this person's African or not. But that's a certain criteria that I use. And based on this criteria, I find a share that is surprisingly low, right? First of all, I find a share that is incredibly low. First of all, I find that these 10 journals that I audit do dedicate a good chunk of their space to covering African topics. So certainly Africa is like maybe a third of the coverage. So, so Africa is a third of the coverage. And then I find that the Africa representation is much, much lower than that particular coverage. So this is the criteria that I use. One can certainly quibble with it, but it's sort of one criteria, and folks can use many other types of criteria. And subsequent to the publication of that paper, which was based on a blog post I wrote 5 years ago, one angry morning when I woke up, I just sort of scribbled up a blog post. I have seen that some people have added to the debate, and they use much, much more sophisticated measures of diversity. I myself, with a couple of co-authors, published a paper in Applied Economics Letters this year, which is much more refined than the particular Economy and Society journal article. So that's clear. That's the method that I used. And I find that that share is low. If I just look at papers in general, and then when one looks at papers that are led by an Africa-based author, or even solo authored by an Africa-based author, that share is even much, much lower, right? So that's one way, that's one aspect of the Africa problem, that particular thing. The fact that, you've got, these journals are pretty active in discussing the continent, but you find that Africa-based authors, one might even say, which approximate Africans, is much, much lower in sort of the people who are contributing to that debate. The other point that I looked at was the editorial boards of these particular journals, right? If they dedicate a non-negligible share of their coverage on Africa, you'd expect that there will be Africa-based editors on the editorial boards. I think it goes without saying, that's sort of commonsensical. But even that, for example, the Journal of African Economies, which is 100% coverage on Africa. At the time I did the audit, I haven't gone to check now, but I doubt it's changed so much. I don't think they had even a single, perhaps they might have had one Africa-based editor at the time I did this audit. And I think this is prima facie evidence that this is a problem. I think this is, and I don't think one has to debate that here. This is a serious problem, right? We're studying social science, which is quite complex, quite contextual. There's also tacit knowledge, and one wants that kind of knowledge to be brought to bear in some of these debates. And I think the absence of sort of African-based scholars in this particular debate, especially in the influential journals that possibly set policy, that possibly shape our mental models about how Africa works. I think it's really problematic to see that absence. Yeah.
So that's my next question about the consequences of this problem. In a way, it's really sort of a classical epistemological question about the universal laws of economics. Do they apply in the same way everywhere? What would, is an economist based in a place would have a different vision if the laws are sort of natural laws versus contextual and everything. And so, so you talk a bit about this, like the underrepresentation of people based, and I like this criteria because you could also have people coming from a different place but spending enough time, but also collaborating with people in a certain place. And so, the consequences of this underrepresentation in terms of knowledge, do you think it's just a question of data, of contextual knowledge, or do you think there is also an issue with the type of, you talk about mainstream, dominant way of doing economics? So is it just data? Is it just the problem of misapplication of good models, or is it about the discipline more broadly and the model they use in general? And
I mean, that's a very useful, a very, very interesting question, quite complex one. I think, so this idea of like universal laws of economics, I think this is a fantastical idea to my mind. I think, we're not physical scientists, right? We're not like, we're not physicists who have sort of like, there's some general laws about how the universe works. We're dealing with, human beings who are complex, who have, emotions, feelings, cultures, mores, quite complex, or very complex civilizations and that kind of thing. So I think to expect that you would deduce universal laws, is a bit hubristic, in my opinion. And that's the problem, right? And I think, and for me, how did I sort of come to the realization that this was a problem? I was a graduate student at the, PhD student at the University of Cape Town, and the University of Cape Town is very sort of mainstreamish, neoclassical in its orientation. So it is very much in conversation with, North America, Western Europe, and specifically mainstream vintages of the disciplines, which is mostly neoclassical economics, right? This idea that markets are great. The idea that if you're going to have any development, it should come from the market, that kind of stuff. So I was reading this, I mean, like any graduate student, I was obviously enthralled. Some new paper comes out in the Journal of Development Economics or in the American Economic Review, and it's on an African country, or it's on Zambia, sometimes that might happen, which is a country that I'm from. I would excitedly read these pieces because I'm saying, wow, there's probably some story about why we are poor in here. I would read these things and they'll have no resonance with my own sort of experience, my own sense of context. And I wasn't just alone. It is possible that I'm just completely cynical, but even my colleagues, what's interesting about the University of Cape Town is the PhD cohort was mostly African. So we're mostly like students from African countries. And we'll be saying this has no resemblance. I mean, friends from Lesotho would say to me, this has no resemblance to like this context that they've described. And I think, Cleo, if you've read a mainstream vintage economics paper, you'll know that there is a section in there which says the context or the setting, and it's often like very, very brief, right? It's the economist Branko Milanovic has often said, it's probably taken from Wikipedia. It's often very brief, right? But that's the most interesting part, right? And that's the part that's papered over. Much of the action will be in the quants and the quantitative stuff, the data stuff. But as we all know, you can't understand the data. Data as a data generating process. Right? Data was generated by human beings, right? And they were, right. So if you don't understand the context, if you don't have a deep appreciation of the context, the data will tell you nonsense, and you think that's nonsense. That nonsense is true. I mean, there's many examples. I don't know if I went through them in my paper, but there's many examples. For example, the classic one is there's a famous paper written on India about land reform. And I think it was published in the leading journal and by two Western economists. And basically this paper was making the argument about land reform had happened in India, and then we're seeing some result in the data, whatever it might be. And when it was circulated among Indian students in India, they had a laugh. because yes, it was on the statute books, it was on the legislative books, it was on the laws, but nobody had implemented them because they were so fantastic with these things. They were probably a Western imposition or whatever. But this is the kind of stuff. But this paper was published, highly cited, possibly influenced how people thought about land reform at the World Bank and other places. So this is the kind of stuff that, so there's many layers to the question that you asked me, one of which is neoclassical economics itself is problematic, I think, and doesn't matter where you're practicing it from. I know in Western Europe, in North America, there's lots of movements that critique neoclassical economics, right? It's problematic there. It's even much more problematic where I come from because, again, of this underrepresentation. This also, it's not just underrepresentation, it's also the fact that even those who are represented have minimal power. The power imbalances in some of these authorship, co-authorship relationships. There's issues of aid money. Often the northern scholar has the money, those kinds of things. Yeah, so I hope I'm sort of helping you in my responses. I feel like I'm going all over the place, but it is quite an emotive topic for me.
And I think it's interesting the way you present it as so it's a problem with different multiple layers, and I think it's really interesting to try to analyze the link between the people doing something and what they are actually doing, because this is something, a sort of reflexivity that is sort of common in some disciplines, but not in economics, because it's a bit the view from nowhere. You're not spending time saying, I'm this person writing from there. And so that led me to a multi-layered other questions on one is what is specific to economics, in a sense that other social science have done that, meaning when I say done that, studying people, places with this view from nowhere, but usually the view from the center or from the sort of like imperial core of thing like this, and what would be sort of specific to economics. And I'm just popping it to just give one hypothesis I have, which is because of this closeness to power and policy. And so you have now, and in the past maybe it was other discipline, but you have this very this specific status of economics in policy circle. And so maybe my question is like, is it still specific to economics, this underrepresentation, and is it specific to some subfield of economics? And maybe the two questions can be separated, but I think there is a link in the sense that I don't know for land economy, but for example, development economics, you have a very strong debate on the methods used, the rise of RCT, and also one, I don't know if it's original, but I have the idea that some places are overstudied. And so you have this books that are like on the economization of life by Michel Murphy. We talk about Bangladesh, where one or two villages became this sort of laboratory for social scientists coming from the West, who just, I don't know, overused this sort of field, and that create a very specific relationship. And this is not only about the knowledge, this is about the funding you get, this is about the link to international organization, this is the link about this complex policy network between NGOs, international organization, and academics. And so, would you see there is specificity that is linked to economics and also specificity of this underrepresentation in specific subfield of economics? How do you, in the case of countries in Africa, especially?
Thanks, Cleo. You ask very interesting questions with multi-layered. I like that. So I think the first thing you touched on was this idea of reflection, right? Self-reflection. How is it that economics doesn't have this self-reflection that one tends to see in other disciplines? And I think it's not controversial to say that in many social sciences, sort of rose at the same time as empire, and many of them so rose to justify empire, right? Anthropology is one of the classic cases. Anthropology was pretty much in the service of empire, but what one has seen over the last couple of decades is some degree, I don't know, I'm not an anthropologist, but it seems to me anthropologists are kind of more aware of some of these problems than one sees in economics. I mean, economics is completely far out. I mean, especially in the mainstream vintage, it is pretty much still steeped in colonial sort of mentality, this idea of the civilizing mission, right? I mean, many economists from the West unconsciously believe that they are coming to help, quite like the missionaries of yore were coming to civilize. We have the answers. We're coming to tell you the answers. You guys, don't have the answers. There's also this other aspect of simplicity. Africa is a simple place. We have the answers to study this simple place. And this, for example, you will see this idea that you touched on now about studying, like in Africa, it's mostly Kenya, right? And even in Kenya, a particular place in Kenya called Busia, like a particular place in Kenya generates a lot of the RCT evidence. And then when you read the paper says blah, blah, blah in Africa, right? Fertilizers, are helpful to farmers in Africa, whatever. You read the actual paper, you find it's actually in Busia, which is a part of Kenya, right? And then you wonder, you can only make this leap to generalize if you think that the people you're studying are the same, are simple, just kind of like how the missionaries thought about us. So economics still has this colonial mentality, this colonial mindset, right? So that's one aspect of the problem. And when you have this colonial mindset, there's no point in being reflecting. Do you think the missionaries reflected about whether what they were doing was bonkers? No, they thought it was right. This is right. There's nothing that's going to stop us from this mission of civilizing these brutes. That's one way of looking at it. The other thing that's problematic about economics is that about 60 or 70 years ago, it became very mathy, right? So Paul Samuelson, who's a North American economist, publishes a book called, I think I've forgotten what, Foundations of Economic Analysis or something. But this book is really now saying economics is like physics. We can describe economic behavior using differential equations. We can, use, axioms of mathematics, this kind of thing. So it becomes very scientific, right? Which it actually just became scientific, not scientific at all. And then once you become scientific, right? Then, I mean, this idea of, do you think physicists are self-reflecting about their relationship with the atoms? They're not. Atoms are inanimate, they're there to be studied. So again, there's this revolution that happens in economics, especially in neoclassical economics, that becomes very mathematical and very scientific, right? And, and then what better to confirm it than the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences is then endowed in the late 60s. So we become a proper science, right? Using equations, scientific methods, pure scientific methods to sort of tell the story and answer research questions. So exactly, and then you have all these kinds of problems. So yeah, I mean, and is it any better in other? So is it better in other sub-disciplines of economics? So you have neoclassical economics, you have other approaches to economics, you have heterodox economics. I haven't looked at the degree of representation in sort of heterodox economics, but if one can take anything from sort of Twitter debates, it seems to not be better, or at least if it is, it's slightly better. But I've heard a lot of commentary that even in heterodox economics, one can see this sort of problem, right? So again, I think it's quite related to economics as a discipline itself, and how it's never gotten over its colonial hangover or its colonial mission, its colonial raison d'etre, the reason why it arose to justify empire. And I think it's never gotten over that particular hangover. And then along the way, it became very scientific. And then when you become scientific, there's no time to be self-reflective, that kind of stuff. And I'll be curious to hear from other disciplines how anthropologists, for example, if the problem is much less than it was during the colonial days. But yeah, that's in my...
And yeah, we have an anthropologist in the room. I hope she could comment or jump on that. I still have a question, but I think it would be nice to hear what you think, Alice.
Yeah, I mean, Grieve, I didn't introduce myself, but I'm an anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist of Western Europe. Okay. But I do think there's an interesting way here in which the anthropology comparison helps us come at this at a different angle, which is that anthropology, of course, is all about context, right? So in terms of the substance of our analysis, we're doing the opposite kind of move. But in terms of the representation issue, I mean, I'm not sure there's a social science that is as white as anthropology is. still. And that might not be the case in all journals, etc. But certainly when it comes to thinking about kind of Western institutions and representation, it's an incredibly kind of particularly white Euro-American practice. And so I was just thinking about that as obviously on one hand it's very similar, on one hand it's very different to the problem that you're describing, and that helps us maybe come at the what is the link between representation and the practice of the discipline and then the substance of analysis. Mm-hmm. And then also that I think we also configure the view from nowhere in a different way, right? So the way in which this excuse is still excused is that anthropologists are outsiders, you know, the outsider who becomes an insider. And this is our kind of epistemological move that we make, but the outsiders are always, you know, Euro-Americans going elsewhere rather than vice versa predominantly. So I was just, which is a different way of configuring the view from nowhere than the way in which it's done in economics, which is this kind of mathematized, obviously, practice. So I don't know if that comparison might help us think then about this relationship between representation in the practice and kind of the theory that it produces. But also I'm aware that Cleo has lots of questions to come back to as well.
Yeah,
that's super interesting. Yeah.
Can I jump on this to go back to traveling researcher, because you're also like based in different countries in a way. And so I find if you look back at history, there is very few cases, but there is few cases of this sort of outsider position as creative in terms of knowledge. So you have this end of 19th century economists from India going back to Europe and see, and so there is a paper by Maria Beck on this, how a group of Indian economists actually see poverty in England. And so you have like this sort of reverse, and it's also attached to specific knowledge, because they were thinking, what would be an Indian economics, Indian political economy, not only in terms of giving more context, but like process of thinking and theory. And you do also have the same in America when they choose Gunnar Myrdal to do the research on race, because he was coming from a non-imperialistic country. And so it's written in the project. So he could, so that was Sweden. And so he traveled in America and was supposed to have this better vision. But he also worked with a lot of American scholars, 75 of them. So that gave a bit of perspective to also what is collective work in science. Anyway, my question was about this, and also, so we talk a lot about the problem. And so I would like to hear you about the sort of remedies, but in a way, because, for example, you talk a lot about the legacy of imperialism, but there is also a Pan-African movement. There is the independence movement, who also created new policy, planification. There was sort of in history, there was also different way to do economic policy and economics, I guess, and especially in some countries. I'm thinking of more of North Africa, but and so what are this sort of legacy or tradition of thought that have been overlooked and underrepresented on the continent, worldwide, and that came from the continent? And how do you see this? What's the solution? Is it more funding for university in specific countries? Is it more exchange? Is it just a change of culture in the top 5 or in the discipline? So that's big. But like, I would like to hear you a bit more. I think we got a lot on the problem, but okay, what's next?
Thanks, Cleo. By the way, I want to put in a plug for a book by a friend of mine that's just out. You mentioned Gunnar Myrdal. So a friend of mine called Maribor Moret has just written a book called White Philanthropy. And basically, and I'm in conversation with her about that book tomorrow. At some point, I'll put the particular event in the chat here. And it's interesting you mentioned Gunnar Myrdal, because yes, she's very critical of that whole process. In fact, when he consulted, it was really writing about the Negro problem in the US, and the 75 social scientists Ghana Murdo consulted were most likely overwhelmingly white. And Du Bois, for example, had some things to say about that particular landmark report, that landmark book that shaped how folks thought about the Negro problem in the US. So again, that's another, even somebody like Ghana Murdo, who was supposed to be, this thing is not neutral. It's even the Carnegie Corporation, who funded that particular study, was very careful in shepherding how Ghana Murdo went about doing his research. And I think Alice also had some very interesting things to say about anthropology. And actually, when Alice was talking, I was thinking about much of the work that's been quite influential in the citation way, which I dislike in economics, has had its base on anthropology. So a lot of these people do this quantitative economic history, this thing where you go back 100 years and then you see something happened 100 years and then you say, okay, this thing has long running effects, and then you run some statistical relationship between the event 100 years ago and much later. Much of that work is actually based on sort of anthropologists 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, doing all this stuff in Africa. So I mean, economics is, and I imagine Alice would say, wow, we've moved on from, like the feud has moved on from all this problematic stuff, but guess what, we're using it. Again, we're still stuck very much in this. We love the colony, we love, it's like, but yeah, so what's the solution, Cleo, is a question you're asking me. And you're right, I think one has to look at history, for example, right, as a model. What's really fascinating for me in some of the work that I'm doing now is I'm going back to look at the post-independence period in Africa. So this is like the 60s, right? The model independence year is 1960. And you see this pretty much attempt by African economists to really define sort of a view of African economics, if there's such a thing. And you see that at different places on the continent. You see it in Dar es Salaam, at the University of Dar es Salaam, you see it at Ibadan, you see it at Makerere, you see it at sort of different parts of the continent. And these guys are seriously engaging with the issue of development. Like, what do we do to develop, right? There's, and when I read that work, I tend to be, it resonates with my own experiences. Like, this stuff shouldn't be very complex, that when you explain it to your grandmother, she would not get it. When I say explain to my grandmother or my mother, I say, look, this person's writing 1970, and they're talking about dependency theories. They're talking about the development of underdevelopment. They're talking about, sort of like neo-colonialism as a reason why, the African continent is perpetually stuck in this, growth malaise. The stuff it seems about right. So there's this real attempt to try to build up a scholarly community that sort of approaches problems from that point of view. And then, structural adjustment comes in the 80s and destroys the African university, right? The World Bank has those famous statistical data of theirs, which tells us that the returns, however they calculated that, the returns to primary education are much higher than the returns to higher education. Ergo, therefore, we should stop funding higher education and rather fund. It's actually funny, when I read my friend's book on Ghana Murdo, she's talking about, like 100 years ago, how American philanthropies are really concerned about how to educate the Negro and how to educate the colonial African. And you really see there this emphasis on practical fields, carpentry, agriculture, this kind of stuff. So it's funny to see that the World Bank is doing something quite similar in the 80s. And then the African university is decimated, right? When it's decimated, immediately African scholars are no longer have autonomy, right? So if I teach at the University of Zambia today, it was very difficult for me to get funding for my work, right? And to be able to ask the research questions that I think are useful in asking, why is all this capital flight? Why is all this capital flight moving from Africa to the north? Who facilitates it? How does it happen? Right? Why is it that multinational corporations are still doing this transfer pricing? These kinds of questions, you hardly can get funding for them. But I'll get a lot of funding for HIV/AIDS. I'll get a lot of funding for, for conflict. I'll get a lot of funding for corruption. I'll get a lot of funding for, Africa's cultural problem, because Africans are just lazy. I'll get a lot of funding for that kind of stuff, but not really for these kind of deep questions that one wants to ask. That's how I see it. And the structural adjustment era is really fascinating because there was still a critical mass of African researchers who are trying to engage with the problem, who are trying to figure out exactly what's causing this lack of malperformance in the economy. And those guys are right. We're right. I mean, read their work today, and there's several papers, fortunately that work has survived. You see that it was right, because 15 years later, the IMF came and said, mea culpa, we are sorry, right? Although the way they say it, they say, we have figured out that we were wrong, right? So if you read their mea culpa, it doesn't even cite any of those guys, but they just realize themselves, wake up one morning and realize, oh, damn it, 20 years ago, it caused a lot of damage. So those guys were right? But then again, they were silenced. They were never in the debate. They were never showing up in the journals that were very influential. Instead, we had the Easterlys in the 90s, remember Easterly and Levin's paper, African Growth Tragedy, which pretty much starts history in 1980, right? So it starts in 1980. Why is Africa such a perennially underperforming place? It starts in 1980, but Africa's history doesn't start in 1980, doesn't start in 1960. It starts well before that. So.
I think your point about the type of funding available for the type of topic is really interesting, because it's a renewal of this Orientalism, for other places, like exotic poverty, which drive, but it also, I guess it's also driven by this idea that, okay, we have to do priorities. So let's fund, I don't know, primary education or thing like this, which doesn't see like as a global picture of a country, and would just concentrate on specific urgent or perceived as urgent problems. Very interesting. I will just stop there, because I think there is many interesting questions. And yeah, I really like the way it's not just about the people where they're based. It's about the old system of like producing knowledge and implementing things. So maybe we'll have a question. I give the mic.
And I see some friends in the chat. Justin is a good friend of mine. We've interacted before. It's nice to see some friends come to this seminar. That's true.
Jostein's actually one of our previous organizers. There's a couple of questions before his, but seeing as we're talking, you want to come in and ask yours?
Should I come in, Alice? Oh, so good to see you, Grieve, and thanks for this great and really important paper. My question was kind of about if you could talk a bit about the marriage between some of these elite universities in the US and also economics journals. So building on that, I was going to ask you, does economics perhaps also have a Latin America problem or a South Asia problem? Is this, to what extent is a problem we're seeing here also a problem of this symbiosis between a few elite universities and these economics journals?
Thanks, Justin, for that question. And nice to see you. Yes, economics has a problem. Period. I think that's, and you're right. And I think when I talk to this paper that we just published in Applied Economics Letters, I published it with some colleagues from Latin America. And in writing this paper, it was just quite fascinating to just see similarity in some of the stories, the similarity in the frustrations. So it's quite clear that it has a Latin American problem as well. It's quite clear that it has a South Asia problem. I don't know now the extent to which, which region has a bigger problem than the other, but it was quite clear in talking to these colleagues of mine that they were equally frustrated. I've seen tweets from friends from Mexico expressing the same kind of anger. They see a paper in the AER, an American Economic Review or wherever, and they're like, this is complete bollocks. It does no way resonate with, it doesn't diagnose the problem very well, right? It is not, some of this stuff should be commonsensical, to be honest, but this strive for, complexity and kind of stuff. And you're right. And what's the relationship between the elite universities and the top 5 journals? Yeah, I mean, for example, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, I think, is a Harvard journal. And I have heard that, a good chunk of the people publishing there have some Harvard connection. Either they're at Harvard or they're students of Harvard professors, or they're at MIT, which is just 5 minutes drive to the other side. So yeah, there's this very strange relationship, and again, it just speaks to the sense of hierarchy in the discipline, right? We think, okay, you know, these guys at Harvard, they probably self-regulate themselves. They're superhuman, these guys. They can, you know, they lack bias, that they can sit there, regulate themselves. The space that they allocate to themselves in their journal is really a reflection of merit, you know, because they're at Harvard, and we know that's not pretty right. So, I mean, I hope I was very satisfactory in giving you this answer. But I think, yeah, colleagues from other parts of the world tend to have the similar sort of experiences as I do.
Great, thanks. That also raises, I mean, a set of questions that I think have been part of this in the start, which is how does this problem in economics actually map onto a broader kind of inequities between universities in different countries and the ways in which they're granted authority and leverage within the field. David Good, do you want to come in and ask your question, or shall I?
Yes, well, happy to come in, Alice. Thank you very much, Grieve. The question I put in the chat box concerns whether or not the problem is with mathematical modeling or the ways in which the models get mistaken for the world. Now, obviously, you've got a certain kind of modeling capacity. You would tend to look for theories and data which kind of fit into those models. But that's not a modeling problem itself. It's, in some respects, I worry at times that attacking the use of mathematical modeling can lead us to actually think that that's the problem, whereas I don't think it is the problem. That's just a tool and a technique. May not be one that can be used very widely, but the problems lie elsewhere, as others have been saying. It's about the assumptions you make about what notions of value are in a society and so forth. So I put in the chat, very interesting little paper a couple of friends of mine wrote, Erica Thompson and Lenny Smith, about escape from model land. They characterize all the ways in which models can mislead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I think, David, I agree with you that I think often the idea about modeling is that modeling is supposed to add some clarity. I mean, there's some value to modeling, right? As an intellectual exercise, I think there's some value to it. But I think the point you're making is what the point I agree with, is the assumptions that are hardly interrogated, right? Mm-hmm. That really are the bedrock of those models. And often those assumptions have to speak to some sense of reality. And I think one of the things that happened, the papers I read as a graduate student were full of this modeling. I mean, we read a lot of Acemoglu's stuff on theories of economic growth, and there was massive amounts of modeling there, which he was claiming is supposed to be, you know, generalizable and supposed to speak to many contexts. But the assumptions were, I hardly spent any time on the assumptions and really saying, are these assumptions realistic? What sort of, like you're saying, what sort of notions of value, notions of justice are underpinned by some of these assumptions? And I agree with you. I think that's one huge problem. I said to Justin, the field has a problem. And I think one of it is this mathematization, which has its value. It's valuable, it's useful, but I think we spend a little less time on interrogating the assumptions. We also spend a little less time interrogating the data. That then goes into these kinds of models. Yeah.
It produces this sort of tendency to want to find data that you can model rather than data that matters.
Yeah, the old looking for the keys underneath the lamppost.
Yeah, it's a classic one. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And I, as a graduate student, I regret the amount of time I spent trying to find nice data to answer sexy questions when I could have been spending much of that time really answering the problems that mattered. And I wasted time, because I was looking for clean data.
I think we've all done that. You're not alone.
Yeah, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah.
Princesa, do you want to, I'm not sure I totally pronounce your name correctly, but the question that's just been put in the chat box, do you want to come on and ask that, or shall I read it out? Okay. So we've just got a question that was some more kind of comment that somebody saying that they completely agree and they struggled, especially when it comes to journals about civil wars. They said that where they're from, we all know that they are mineral wars funded by multinationals to gain access to minerals. Many UN reports have come out, and some foundations try to bring them to life. However, they get silenced, and many journals turn the truth into conspiracy theories, unfortunately. Was that comment. We also had an earlier question from Tom Lyons. Tom, would you like to kind of come in and summarize that?
Thank you. Yes. I think this is a universal problem. First of all, I say this is such a shame that such an important topic has so few economists from Europe and North America at this webinar. They need to hear this story, not those of us who are already convinced of the problem. But of course they don't, they're not interested. I think this is a universal problem, which is probably at its worst with respect to Africa for well-known historical reasons. One thing which I think is extremely important about Africa, really stands out to me as a statistic, is the very small amount of trade done by African countries with other African countries. Far less than any other continent. There's obvious historical reasons arising from the fragmentation of Africa under colonialism and the reinforcement of commodity-dependent modes of development, relying on international markets under structural adjustment. That's a special African issue, which is ignored. There are improvements now with the formation of the African Union and so on, but it's got a very long way to go. It's thrown right out of the window in the 1980s, when the Organization of African Unity wanted to form a common market, and the World Bank just refused to listen. But it goes wider. I mentioned in the chat my experience in the former communist world. Now, I had done degrees. I'd studied Russian. I'd done a degree in master's degrees up to MPhil level in Soviet studies and development studies in IDS. But the sort of knowledge that people like me had about, first of all, development processes, and also about the nature of the pre-existing economy, which was centrally planned. It was not a money-based economy. That was completely ignored. The whole thing was thrown in with the people who had failed in the previous decade with their attempts to deal with the debt crisis, with the dogma of structural adjustment, pushed into countries which didn't even have the monetary institutions that were required even to perform those monetary policies, and the result was complete catastrophe. And I mentioned also an issue which I'm not very familiar with, but I've come across in Japan. And I mean, this is an imperial science. Started in Scotland. It happened in the late 18th century. Dominated in the 18th and early 19th centuries by British and other West European people, and since 1945 by the succeeding imperial power, the United States. Now, how that is translated into actual economic theories and economic practice is a very complicated concern. Putting it as broadly as I have is very, very bold. But I think we need to have something of that sort of perspective and actually get away from this terminology it's useful in some other contexts, such as white privilege, and say, no, this is go back to old language about imperialism. In which Grieve is doing, and I'm very interested to hear what he says. And I'd love to know more. And I really need to get back to the work that he mentioned from the era of decolonization done in Africa by African economists. That really, surely we need to go back to that and hear what they had to say and work on it, criticize it. Maybe some of it was wrong, I'm sure it was, but it needs to be reworked from an African point of view.
Can I ask Grieve then, do you want to come in and reflect on?
Yeah, I think there's very little to disagree with what Tom said. I mean, I like this sort of historical perspective he has given, and this title of an imperial discipline. That's precisely what it is. And I think a lot of people don't reflect, whoever they might be and wherever they might be. It took me a long time myself to get to this realization that I'm actually in the service of an imperial discipline. Right, a discipline that, so Tom, you're very right about that. And I think you're also right about us revisiting, the 60s and 70s sort of literature. When I read that literature, you're right. It's not entirely correct. There's some things in there that are pretty extreme, but there's some stuff that is super fascinating. And I think what's useful to study about that period, the scholarship itself is important. But how the scholarship community arose is much more important. Figuring out how did they create this community of scholars, this critical mass of scholars. They were engaged in serious scholarship. Right? And what's very interesting is they were not looking at the North as a clearinghouse, which is what we do now. I write a paper and I'm hoping that what does Tom think about what I'm going to write? No, they were just, I'm just going to talk, right? And just on my own terms. And so I think what's really useful is to study, figure out how did that scholarship community arise? How was it sustained? And we know why it went away, partly because of structural adjustment, but why isn't it coming back now? We have big foundations doing all sorts of work. So I'm fascinated also, but I agree with you entirely, Tom. Yeah.
Great. I think we're almost at time. So if there's any kind of final reflections, Cleo and Grieve, that you want to give before we close, then please do feel free.
Can I just say your last point is really important on the emergence of a critical mass of researcher, because I think we have a tendency, I'm an historian of economics, and we did have a tendency to look at individual and even when we also, even for the minorities, in a way, we took like the great women, the great Indian economist, where we don't look at this sort of community of, and I think this was really important in the post-independence, because there was some very local, like specific experience in some country, but also very linked to other international movement, but not centered in Western Europe and America, and there was link between places and projects that were really interesting, and I don't know anything about, and it's problematic, and so I think this idea of how collective group emerge is much more important than to, oh, there was a great man one day working on this issue and is a precursor, and I think this is part of the issue of like we do have need of this building in these places, and we go back to the point you did earlier on how university get destroyed by some program that were coming from outside. So yeah, I really appreciate everything, and maybe I just have a question. So what's your next work, and maybe can you tell us a bit more about?
Thanks, Cleo. I mean, I had super fun here. It's also, when one comes to a seminar talking about, this thing is still controversial, I think. It's nice to see that one is not mad. So like I can see that folks in the audience also see this as a problem. So that's very encouraging for me. I also want to say it's funny that this problem hasn't gone away. I mean, right now I'm speaking to you from Zambia. We're in the midst of what one calls the debt crisis, and the IMF has sort of flown in as they usually do. And it's shocking. I mean, there's a lot of like local resistance and local scholars, who are writing quite critically about this, but the IMF doesn't care. They're not caring to engage any local people and figure out what is the objection, and is there a third way, but so these things are still around. They're still pretty much around. They're not things that are from the past, but still much with us. And we're going to have a policy disaster precisely because of these kinds of things, this lack of, taking local seriously. So what am I working on, Cleo? I mean, I'm working on a book project on these things. So I'm working on a book project on some of these things that we discussed today. I mean, it's one of these. It's an emotional topic. So one that angers me sometimes, frustrates me. Sometimes I run away from it, and I say I don't want to think about this stuff anymore. I want to think about new things. But I think it's super, super important. And I think this particular seminar reminded me that work has an audience, and it's super, super useful. Yeah.
That's great to hear. I look forward to reading it. And I'd also be really interested in your reflections in your own personal trajectory, having been in universities, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in North America, the US. I mean, obviously in your own data set, that would have positioned you differently. And so I'm wondering how the broader maps of the ways in which we kind of instill authority in different institutions also kind of is part of the endurance story here. I think we've got a lively conversation going on in the chat, but I think it's more of a conversation than particular questions. So I think it just kind of leaves us to say thank you. It's been really great to have this conversation today. I've really enjoyed it, And everyone, if you do join us next Tuesday for Melinda Cooper's new paper as well, we're much looking forward to that. So thank you, Grieve, and hopefully see you all again soon.